all your presentations. I wanted to pick up on some, well, I've got lots of different ideas to discuss, but this question of the spatial relationships really kind of intrigued me across your practices. Thinking of the space of the tent, thinking of the space of the theater and the box, and then what you were mentioning about spatial relations. So this kind of space of intimacy, this soft space, this space of trying things out, the space of the miniature and in the theater, in a box. Yeah, so if you'd like to speak to that around the kind of question of the spatial aspect. Because it was very kind of prominent when the tent moves from space to space, and you were speaking how you kept everything in a particular kind of position, although the spatial aspects of the landscape differed so much in each location and had really kind of strong, when you were mentioning the airport road, for example, and then other particular kind of landscapes. And then I was really kind of provoked by the idea of the miniature of the theater being this kind of stage, but then having it in the box. And then what you were saying about that relationship and then moving around in the space. Yeah.
I think with Nikhil's practice, I think he sort of likes to look at nomadic practices as well, where, you know, I think it's important not to think of ourselves as having roots. I think roots are for trees. Humans have legs, and we've moved and circumvented the planet and created ourselves, and are in a constant state of flux in the way we change, and who we become is never stationary, it's never one thing. So in a sense, we are innately nomadic. We're not necessarily, I think architecture and institutions and, in a sense, even urbanization and even colonialism has sort of imposed on us a certain hardness. And I think that what he's really interested in doing is challenging that hardness. And so the idea of a soft space is actually perhaps the best, is perhaps a solution for how we all can live. And I think it's positioning ourselves as people who belong to real estate, you know, who belong to nation and country. I think that's partly what he's trying to subvert. And I think that this is what we share, all of us share, is this idea of subverting, you know, a dominant sort of discourse and dominant dialogue. So, and I think the soft space is a way for me and him to divert attention from the institution.
Joanna?
I'm so into looking at these feathers while I think about what you're saying. It's so...
It's completely elsewhere.
It's wonderful. I had a teacher, Garland Wright, in graduate school who would challenge us to find infinity on the head of a pin, which of course it's there. I started studying physics and then moved to theater in college, and it of course is there, and I think it's very helpful for the students after the cacophony of a group that they didn't choose, and maybe they've never made a collaborative artwork before, or, you know, the closest thing, it brings them straight to siblings, which again is a space that opens up possibilities for inclusion. So I think that little jewelry box is a chance in a way, because it's impossible it's not going to be theater. Not really, but it is to them, so they can do what they want. I'll also say that I think as an artist, space is the ball game. I mean, I can't even think in a room that doesn't make sense somehow to think in, you know? So we try to maintain a studio and a learning environment. I don't lock the door if they're going to be late, because that's not nice. If something happened and they have to, if they want to learn, they can come in, do you know? And that feels good, and then they're not late. So, I mean, I think the rules of the space and the terms, enough rules to so you're not going to fall over. You're not going to, you've got just enough to stand up and do what you want.
Yeah. I don't know. I have two ways of answering that. But like you were saying, there's a silhouette here, and then what's behind the silhouette. And this was important information for understanding what was happening in the space. But this is probably also because, can I share an anecdote? In my parents' home, it was almost like, I hope they never listen to hear this. It was almost like living on a theater set. So they're very concerned with how other people see them. And this whole, I think this obsession with performing the self is probably coming from there. You know how everything has to go back to childhood traumas. We could never use any space comfortably. So the drawing room cushions were always covered because that was for the guests. And then her living room sofas, my mother's living room sofas, were also, there were some guests who would hang out in the living room. So those cushions were always upstairs because they would become sort of, they would lose their form. And so when a guest came to our house, we were so well rehearsed. While they walked from the main gate into the drawing room, it took us 3 minutes, the entire family. Those cushions from there, those, like, take off the sheets from the drawing room sofas and blah, 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 blah. And then we would just sit like we live like this every day, all the time, like, speak in Spanish, and the cushions haven't lost their form. So this whole thing about, I don't know, living on a theater set, and speaking of theater, is probably that. But also, I mean, right now, the three of us in relation to each other, and these presentations in relation to each other's presentation, and then in the context of what's been happening for 2 days. So this is a third space we're in. We've been changing spaces also, and how that's informing what we're experiencing. I don't know if
Absolutely.
I'm making sense.
No,
Yes.
I'm back blabbing.
You know, the container creates the shape you take, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it also comes back to your point you were mentioning of guest and host, just kind of connecting to your point of that kind of, you know, that role change or that relationship that you were finding as you moved from site to site in that. But the performative with the guest is so much part of a different cultural context that, you know, can definitely relate to that, cushions having no shape with that. But yeah, I mean, this change between the guest and the host, I mean, maybe you'd want to kind of say a little bit more about that as you moved across the spaces.
Well, I think the performance space is so is a maker of its own thing, and it's not something that one can be aware of going into it. I think the idea of one submitting yourself to that moment allows for a transformation, and I think this idea of transformation is something that's been brought up quite a bit, and I think performance has that power. It has that power to take what you assume. So I'm really happy you brought up about this notion of assumption, because you cannot begin anything with a series of assumptions. And you know, in a sense, there is this submission to not just the performative moment, but also the space that it creates in the place. And I've really enjoyed this kind of dialogue between space and place over the past 3 days. And I feel that that's what does the role reversal, when suddenly your space becomes a place. And you realize that everyone in here is playing a role. So in a sense, as soon as somebody would walk into that tent, the dynamic of presence changed. And I remember him telling me this, that in fact, for the first time in his performances, he actually interacted with the audience directly, in a sense, because he was a stranger in a strange place. And it was really important for him to make anybody who walked into the space feel extremely comfortable and not alienated. So it works very well in an institution like in a gallery to say, okay, I'm setting up the conceptual fourth wall. But in a space where people don't even know whether this is a performance or not. It was important to set up the dynamic to say, welcome, and please have a seat. What would you like? There's a glass of wine. There's maybe some fruit, some biscuits. So it's whatever one had at hand, one was sharing. And in a sense, I totally relate to what she was saying about how the guest is, in a sense, the god. In a sense, you create these ceremonies and these rituals around the welcoming of people. I think these things are very also ingrained in our body, and they're ingrained trauma or intergenerationally. And we've kind of inherited these ideas of hospitality. So it's really, the context is what really kind of creates and shapes the role that one plays in a piece.
And then how with the Met project was that also just really different in the kind of, the kind of positions of the audience with that?
Well, I mean, if the documenta piece or the tent piece was about welcoming, in a sense, the Met piece was about kind of creating the difference between the audience and the performing body. It was actually kind of like a mirror, a laterally inverted mirror to the documenta performance, because here everybody was there to come to consume an art object. And that was very clear. You pay a ticket, you pay your $21 to get in, and once you're in, you're there to consume everything. So there's this feeling of sense of entitlement that people come with to receive and consume an art object, especially in a city like New York, which is such a powerhouse. It's such a consumerist city. It's a money-driven city. So there's this. So it was actually an amplified, alienating feeling that actually became the stuff of the performance, and this idea of making eye contact with people in the audience sort of became really important for him, because it was really important to state that this was the art object that was going to look back at you and not sit passively behind a glass case. So those two things were very, very different. In a sense, the idea was to intimidate, to some extent, the audience that was watching there, but also hold them and hold their curiosity and gaze. And it was completely the reverse in the Documenta project.
I also wanted to pick up on this question of archive that has been kind of discussed over the last couple of days, and particularly your comments about how the archive is all on your laptop, and there are so many archives like that, particularly across the global south, that there's this fragility of the archive, there's this that it's based on so many individual initiatives or different kind of projects that stop and start, and just thinking of the problematics that you raised about, well, how do you archive this, and particularly your kind of approach of using the witness as a testimony, particularly for a lot of there are so many practices and art experiences that were not documented. There are very few photographs of them, there are very few slides of them, and you can only really kind of access them through going back to storytelling to happening. So, yeah. And then also you're archiving through the drawing process that you were mentioning, and Joanna too, through these different iterations of the course. So
I think my interest in the role of the witness is also coming from my own practice. There were some of the works that I showed everybody in our private group 2 days ago, and it was, I think my interest in the witness definitely comes from my own practice, but then also, I mean, when I'm teaching, I am continuously making my students think about not taking the camera for granted, because now we're so obsessed with documentation, we have to prove, we need evidence. So regardless of the fact that the presence of the camera is ruining your work and it's interfering with your work, what you're wanting to do, it's doing the opposite. People still have a camera on a tripod or somebody taking photographs. So I want them to think creatively about documentation also. What are the other ways? There's a work that we spoke about, there's a work that my collaborator Hurmat and I do where we invite a complete stranger over for a 3-course Pakistani meal. And it's a very private, intimate dinner. And so the way we document it is through post-dinner emails from our guests. So yes, they're witness accounts, but some of them are very poetic post-dinner accounts. They don't speak about what happened at the dinner, unlike these witness accounts. So yeah, other ways of documenting.
And this question came up yesterday too, this question. I keep moving back. I want to sit in a circle. Then I can't see Tina.
Yeah.
I think
There
Nikhil's
is
friend
no
has
circle,
yeah.
it's a line.
This is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is better.
Thanks, everybody. Yesterday we got a question in the archive panel about whether or not, what if the artist doesn't want to be archived? And I almost said, too bad. Because it's too bad, because somebody's aunt saw it and wrote a letter to their cousin, and 100 years from now, the letter surfaces because the cousin's kid was a movie star, and the letters go through, and then you find, I mean, we're dealing with the public, so it's out of our control. So I think of the archive as all of my students, all the projects, they make the project, but they have to submit the archive for the grade. And the archive of the project, it does not need to make sense to me. It needs to be useful to them. So teaching archiving as an artistic process, not as a record, the idea is that you can put your hand in and pull out. If you're revising the piece, when I put sound in a work, there's 8 things I didn't put in. When I go back, there they are. And I'm different because it's a year later, and I'm in a different place, and that other artifact of the research is more interesting. And that happened with this presentation. I came here in the car, and I was just working away from the old one, making a different thing. So I think of it differently.
I mean, aren't our bodies kind of like the archive that we carry with us all the time? I mean, the time is constantly writing itself on us, like the scars, the wounds, the traumas, the joys, the pains, the pleasures. I think we are, in a sense, our own museum, and in this museum is contained every single thing that we've experienced. And in our interaction, we are constantly in exchange of this record, I think language and the way language is constructed is primarily so that we can have collective memory.
And then it all just goes away.
And then it all just goes away.
Like, forget it.
Yeah.
Whatever's on your laptop or in your library or where, goodbye. I mean,
Because it's not
finished.
nothing.
You don't get to keep it.
Yeah, exactly.